As we keep asking the questions that really matter for an African business, we delve into whether Africa is on the brink of a global recession. As the world's major economies struggle with inflation and supply chain challenges, some experts warn of the possibility of a global recession. Others consider that this is merely a slowdown in the wake of the global pandemic. Either way, there are numerous implications for Africa's economies. Our invited experts will weigh in on how a recession may affect the competitiveness of Africa's business sector and how this may vary by industry and country. Join us as we expand. Dunning Africa Center. It's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation.
Welcome to the sixth, Dunning Africa Center webinar. Delighted to be your host once again. And of course, today we are again dealing with a very topical issue. It's nice to identify, issues that are going to be coming up the hill. So rather than, we want at Henley and at Dunning Africa Center to be ahead of the curve, to catch the main issues, the big issues, before they become issues, so to speak. And this is, of course, is very timely right now as we come to the end of the calendar year, but we also see the post-pandemic effects, the effects on the economy becoming more visible. We see supply chain problems around the world. We have conflicts taking place, which are affecting other supply chain in other ways, and a variety of economic problems. And really, there's a lot of talk about is there going to be a recession? And some people say, why are we talking about it? It's already here. Other people are saying, it's this recession is only a regional thing. And some people say, well, it's a slowdown. It's a natural adjustment in the wake of the pandemic and all of these problems that we've had for the last 3 years. So these are all legitimate points, because none of these people who are talking are stupid. They really have some sense, and there's something to be gleaned from these different perspectives. But nobody really has been addressing the question, because these discussions have been taking place from a very Eurocentric perspective, or an American perspective, or a Chinese perspective, and we haven't really come to the question of Africa. And that's that's why we really are picking up this topic on this occasion, because it's not entirely, before I became an academic, I worked in Hong Kong as a business person. And at that time, the major economy was Japan, in Asian economy was Japan. And our concern always was, there was an expression that if Japan sneezes, the rest of Asia catches a cold. Now we are in the 21st century, and of course the issue of Japan is no longer the case, but there's still the idea that a sneeze that takes place in Europe, no matter how much we want to think is not the case anymore, has a considerable and profound effect on the African economies. How much of an effect? And that's what we're going to ask our distinguished panelists today. And we'll have a conversation about this, looking at the angle. What does it mean? What does it mean? Why has it happened? And hopefully we can even point our ways to seeing what can be done. What's the, there has to be a silver lining. I really hope that there's a silver lining. I don't want to depress everybody and increase the risk of suicide amongst our participants. We try to be positive as much as possible. So joining me today, I have Nosa Igbinadolor, who is a journalist and specializing in business issues, political economy issues. I think he works for one of the most influential newspapers in West Africa, Business Day. I recommend it highly to you if you haven't come across it. I definitely rely on it to stay up to date on issues, particularly, of course, around Nigeria, but also the rest of West Africa. He's also, I'm very proud to say, a former student of mine. So, I feel, one always has that satisfaction when your students are, successful. You take some, feel you have some credit to take for it, even if they don't give it to you. And then we have MD Ramesh, who is CEO of TGI Agribusiness and a old Africa hand who has been, so he was one of the key people behind Olam International, which has a massive footprint across Africa. It was a startup, if I remember rightly, a very small operation, which has turned into one of the largest agribusiness firms in the world. And now he has moved on to TGI Agribusiness. They have a footprint across 8 countries. I'm sure he can tell us a little bit more about that. But look him up. He's certainly a person who has ear to the ground, and you can't be a successful business person for 30 years without having have learned something, and have learned to observe the way the wind blows in different directions. So thank you, the two of you, for joining us for this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajneesh.
Thank you, Professor Narula.
I think let's start with the opening conversation. Really, is there first of all, is there a recession or slowdown? Maybe we should dispense with the idea that there's no recession or slowdown. What do you think, recession or slowdown? Ramesh.
Right. So I've had the opportunity in the last 1 month to visit our key markets in Europe, which I do once a year, and to go around a bit of our operations in Africa. And my view is that while Europe is struggling with its own set of struggles and maybe headed to a recession, I think in Africa, we are looking at a slowdown more than a recession. I think we are far more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. I do see significant challenges coming from the market side from Europe because of the challenges they are going through. But I think a lot of our economies are coming out of the dark, cold winds that they faced during COVID. I see some energy bubbling back. The state of the currencies have left a lot of our governments confused, and they're taking all kinds of actions, not necessarily always well thought out. But I don't think we are headed to a recession. I think it's a slowdown, and that slowdown may last a little bit more. I think all of 23 would be a slowdown, but I don't think it's a recession.
Okay. Nosa, what's your thought on this?
Yeah, so I tend to look at the projections of international financial institutions and experts like you, Professor Narula. And the projections tend to show that 2023 will likely be a slowdown. Whether slowdown or recession, the fact is that the impact of either could be lethal at worst. Look, on the bright side, painful as it may seem, recessions are normal. Boom and bust tends to be the story of every financial system and economy. It only becomes a problem when economies go down and stay down. Africa's 2 largest economies, Nigeria and South Africa, are not newbies to recessions. Nigeria over the last 6 years has faced 2 recessions, same with South Africa. So like I said, the problem will be if they go down and they stay down. African governments, the economies can work towards bringing the economies out of whether a slowdown or recession. That is very possible, yeah.
So let's first consider the factors behind it, because I think there's no clear what are the main issues. And I think the most obvious starting point is COVID. But one of the things that really impressed me it was in a way that COVID did not have as significant effect on Africa as it did in other parts of the world, which one would have thought, that this means that the recovery issues are much smaller. So we started off on a better footing, so to speak, at least from the COVID side. Now, so let maybe I'll open it to you, and you know, tell what do you see this. Again, let's start with Ramesh.
So my view is that during COVID, more than anything else, the isolatory regulations brought about the slowdown and the freeze to the economy, because a lot of people were stuck where they were. And our economies are not the kind that works on a remote basis as efficiently as, say, some of the other ones. Okay. So I'm not going to now judge us against the Europeans and the Asians, because we are at completely different planes. Given that, I think the isolation really led to our slowdown. And that brought about a lot of hardship to our people, because a lot of our work is done physically, manually, and face-to-face. All of that came to a standstill. My view is from there, a recovery is significantly easier. And I'm saying so by looking at, our sector, agriculture, food, where a lot of people are employed. Farmers are going back to the farms. Fertilizer is not easy to come by, but economic activity has come back to full swing. In Nigeria, where there's a large flood, despite that, there is enough farming activity happening and enough food produce coming out. My view is that all of this will come back to norm. Just for your information, the largest cotton crop in Africa is in the neighboring country called Benin. They have a shortfall on account of weather, not on account of the fact that people are not going to the farms. Ivory and Ghana, the two largest cocoa crops in the world, valued at $6 billion, which is not trifling for Africa, is a full crop, is the best crop in the last 3 years, actually. So given this stage, I do not believe that Africa is staring at a recession by any chance. What is likely to happen, and why I'm suggesting it's a slowdown, is on account of the fact that shipments to Europe, etc., may suffer a bit, may get delayed. It might get drawn out over longer periods than they were used to, simply because consumption is not the same in the developed markets. We should be prepared for that. Therefore, inflow of money against a lot of things that we export, not just agricultural commodities, most of the commodities, will take time to come. And therefore, that impact will be felt in Africa. But I do believe that Africa is now back to what it was 2-3 years back. Sorry, 3 years back, just before COVID. I don't see any part of Africa that's now suffering inaction.
Well, looking at Nigeria, three factors have been responsible for the slowdown that's taking place, and what actually led to recessions that took place 2016 and in 2019. Now, first of all, the relatively low price of crude in the market pre this year, and that actually affected income and the government's ability to spend. Of course, what has happened now is with the special military operations or the war in Ukraine, we've seen crude price rise, but then it has not translated to increased income for the Nigerian government. Why? Because we see a government spending almost 10 billion subsidies, and that has been very, very lethal for the economy. So despite the high prices of crude oil, the income of the Nigerian government still remains very, very susceptible to still remains very poor. Then you have instability in the country. In the northeast, you have this long-running insurgency by Boko Haram, and then you have what has happened in the south Niger Delta region, where the bulk of oil is produced, where oil pipelines are destroyed, and where the theft of crude oil has become a recurrent Nigerian state. And what has this done? Nigeria is unable to produce as much oil as it would want to produce. Then, of course, what this is all culminated into is the fact that the government has not had enough money to spend on projects, to spend on programs, to spend on infrastructure. This has affected jobs. This has affected income. And if this continues, what is obviously going to happen is that 2023 will not be different from what it is now, and could lead to severe slowdowns, if not recession.
So I think that we are looking at governments being poorer, essentially, and I think this is across the board that because revenues were down in many cases from sales of commodities and exports and so forth. that we now see that governments have less money to spend on the recovery process. So certainly, but this is also a temporary phenomenon. What other factor? I mean, I know that that other factors come into this beyond simply the Ramesh is nodding away. So
okay. I think the big factor we should remember always is that this continent imports about $45 billion of food. And that leads to a lot of employment, value addition, distribution, and immense amount of economic activity around it. It's not just imported and distributed. It's not simple as that. What we should remember is that the capacity of our governments, which Nosa referred to provide for foreign currency to import $45 billion of food, in my view, is suspect. It has two reasons. One is, of course, our depreciating economies, our depreciating currencies, which call for a significant amount of extra local currency to be able to afford those imports. That's number one. Number two, my view is that in light of the Ukraine-Russia war and in light of the shortage in supplies of agricultural fertilizer and chemicals, most crops across the world will have its set of challenges wherever they are used to application of those. Don't forget, Asia operates at application of fertilizer and chemicals 10 times that of Africa. So they are directly affected much more than we are. Okay, and their fancy crop and yield numbers are all going to suffer during 23, which means they'll get that much tighter in the supplies that they do to Africa because Africa is the largest buyer. Okay, so I therefore believe for those two reasons, food supplies into Africa will have serious challenges. And I'm now talking of rice, and then there is wheat, and then there is sugar, and then there's dairy and edible, all of that stuff. Okay, so given these two things, if food imports into Africa is challenged, then economic activity in Africa will also get challenged. Okay. Governments will face those problems that the public population will ask questions about. Okay, and we have seen this happening earlier in 2008, 2009, just after the GFC. Now, my view is that a lot of African governments over the last 5-7 years, in my experience, are understanding the value of local produce, procured locally, processed locally for local taste. They understand the value of that. Okay, and there are enough governments that are putting policies in place that are helping that. My view is that this specific incident will only support the move that governments have made in that direction. Therefore, we are, in my view, being nudged gently in the right direction if this happens this year. It won't be an outright food shortage where there'll be riots on the streets. It won't happen to that extent, but it will be noticeable. And I think it will be tangible for governments to start thinking about how they must accelerate their policy making to support that kind of activity, which builds resilience in economies such as ours to be self-sufficient in food. Food security has been an old topic, but almost nothing has been done about that. It's only in the last 4 to 5 years I see some governments pushing us in that direction.
So this is so the kind of strategic security, food security being one of the key aspects, and thinking now, moving away from the idea that we can import whatever we need, we don't necessarily need to grow. This kind of neoliberal view that came out of the Washington Consensus 30 years ago, people are now saying, okay, this is not necessarily going to work when supply chains break down, and it creates massive problems. I know that countries like Japan, for instance, have been very strict, refused to budge on the food security issue. And a number of countries have maintained large silos of grain and so forth for this purpose, and of course putting up barriers to imports for that purpose. So I think certainly this is going to be a solution. But coming to now, before we come to the solutions, I want to understand the causes. And so we're looking at the rising, probably what you're saying is rising prices of imports, of basic imports in the next, and even rising in prices in dollars, not to mention local currency. So we have, first of all, them rising prices in dollars because of shortages that are coming up. And then we will have in local currency, it'll be even higher because currencies are depreciating at the same time. Why? Because they are not exporting as much, or if I'm now kind of leading the conversation, but so we're looking at double side supply problem and a demand problem at the same time. Is that what more or less I'm picking up?
Yes. And add to that the mindset of the exporting countries of food grains who are concerned about their own food security. So there is a significant buildup in strategic reserves in a lot of these countries that are producing the food. So it won't be easily available. Yeah.
Okay. No, sir.
Yeah, and of course, the reality is that with most Western countries, Western economies tightening their economic policies, I mean, increasing interest rates and the rest, especially the US, what has simply happened is that the dollar has become very strong compared to local currencies. And this has made a lot of imports very expensive. And African economies tend to depend on imports of food, imports of a large number of consumables. And what it has simply made imports into Africa very, very expensive. So we see, for example, the Naira falling over the last 1 year by as much as over 200%. And what does this mean? It means that to import any product into the country, whether food, whether or other consumables, you're spending more Naira. So it's the cost of living has simply ballooned in Nigeria and many other countries. And so this is impacting the poor, the very poor in the country. And the fear, I mean, there's that legitimate fear of social strife. Yeah.
So this is one of my concerns actually setting up this webinar today, is that there is a very strong Nigeria bias to our panel today. You know, of course, it's not an accident, but I also want, and I think that what I'm concerned about is whether this, you know, Nigeria bias means that we are just assuming that everybody has the same problems Nigeria has. And of course, we know that Nigeria has more problems than everybody else for various reasons. We won't go, this is not a discussion of the ills of Nigeria. It would be a completely different webinar if that was the case. You know, I know Nosa can spend many hours telling us what's wrong with what's inefficient about the Nigerian government, to put it politely. But I think that to what extent, let me ask this to Ramesh, how do you see any difference between regions within Africa? Do you think that, I mean, South Africa has a manufacturing sector, you know, so maybe they will be less affected by this versus, I don't know. I mean, what's your reading?
You also know that South Africa is the single largest food import bill on the continent. So while they have a solid manufacturing base and they produce significantly more finished products in food than any other country on the continent, the fact is that they import a lot of their stuff. Okay, so tomatoes are imported, they don't grow a grain of rice, and they consume 1 million tons of rice. Okay, so that works very much against them. And the rand is not in a particularly good shape either. So the fact of the matter is, I don't think South Africa is in a far better shape than most other African countries as far as that is concerned. The problem is the rest of the Southern African continent is under a lot of pump, apart from Zambia, which has done recent improvements, as you know. The currency is improved, the capacities are improving, but they just don't have the population to produce. They have all the land, they have access to 40% of Africa's land water, but they don't have capacity. So in general, Southern Africa is in a pretty bad shape too. Yeah. East Africa, on the other hand, has the grasslands, has a history of producing food, has, I think, policymakers who are a bit more attuned to farming and agriculture than most other governments. But they have, I think, a different set of challenges. And you're aware of many of them. I therefore don't believe that any region is in a particularly better off shape than the others are. And the challenges that we are going to face are going to be roughly the same. I do understand Nigeria has got a very, very large challenge, especially around the Naira. And that's something that Nosa spoke about. But the Ghanaian CD is not so much better off. So it's not like we are isolated and alone.
So, I mean, you know, sometimes people kind of come up with a kind of one simple solution that the currency is the issue. And then, of course, I've heard people saying, well, then the government should intervene to support the currency. But this is just throwing money into a black hole. in my opinion. Unless you have endlessly deep pockets. If you're Japan, Japan threw in $43 billion to support the yen in the last few months. If Nigeria could spend 43 billion, it would be a different country completely. If they had 43 billion to spend, that's in the entire so-called, it was double the reserves, if I'm not mistaken, no, sir. Which I think around the 20 billion range. So this is these options, the options available to the developed countries are fundamentally different. So going with the fact that you have floating exchange rates, and going with the fact that there is no meaningful intervention possible, and I mean, what else? How can we stop this hemorrhaging, from becoming out of control? I don't want to get into the solutions problem. We're coming to that later on in the conversation. But I mean, the first initial thing is that the normal central bank response in the developed countries is support the currency by buying, and this is not an option for sub-Saharan Africa, even for, in fact, yeah. But let's go with that. Nosa, I know you've been thinking about this particular issue, so you want to say something here?
Yeah. So again, maybe I should apologize for using Nigeria as as a basis of my discussion. It's a place I know very well. So one way to go is to encourage business, local business, then foreign business. Now, in terms of the currency, I think a veritable way to go, and this has been made clear by experts in the country, is to eliminate this dual exchange rate system. That makes it very, very right. What it has done right now is it has become a barrier to investment, because there are quite a number of foreign investors, whether in the airlines, in services, who have not been able to repatriate their profits out of the country because of the toxic role of the central bank in managing the currency. So it is to make the currency more attractive by eliminating this dual exchange rate system and allowing the currency to float and find its value, so that there can be free entry and exit of capital. Nigeria has become, over the last 5-6 years, has become, and I talked to a lot of businessmen who say they're waiting for next year to make investment decisions and about Nigeria, and see whether the next government will take the bold step of eliminating the dual exchange rate system. That's one. And secondly, too, I think helping to grow local businesses will be the way out. To do that will, of course, mean also helping to grow the financial system. The financial system is very weak right now. The banking system is very, very weak right now. Its ability to mobilize capital is very, very limited. And that I think the government can come in this regard.
So one of the all of this conversation is that there is no money to spend on these things. Now, so there's more and more demand for spending, and spending on long-term projects which have no obvious return for several years. But the money, there isn't any money. So we are already, I think, maybe I have to be careful what I say, but maybe somebody in the audience will correct me on this. But most countries are quite indebted already. So, and with interest rates going the way they are right now, I know that 80% of Nigeria's budget is to pay back, is to cover payments.
Debt service, yeah.
So, once you're doing that, and the other 20% disappears in fairly obvious and basic things, they're essentially they're borrowing exactly double of what they need, or what it costs to run the country now, and they have to pay it back in foreign currency. So there already is a capital scarcity, which is part of the reason why there's capital flight happening as well, because the math of the numbers don't work. Is this better in East Africa? I mean, just want to move away from the West African bias a little bit. And I know East Africa is in a much better place. There's greater economic cooperation taking place between the countries. East African free trade space is opening up. As you said, Zambia. You mentioned Zambia. I know these countries are kind of have a positive forward trajectory.
There is one more thing, Raj. In my experience, conversation with East African governments, who I think are a bit more receptive to private sector ideas on what can be done to inject some life into the economy, is a real possibility. So, I can name a few. I don't want to put those names out there, but there are a few countries where conversations with governments are possible, where you can suggest policy protection, policy changes, but with a commitment to make certain investments from the private sector side, sometimes as PPP, largely with a view to increase employment, increase money circulation, and increase productivity. So if it's a private sector driven event, in my view, then results are reasonably sure. Moment it goes into the public sector hands, what happens to results in most of our African public sector. But it's under the commitment of some kind of protection that the government is willing to provide. I know there are countries in West Africa also where this is possible. I suspect right now, given the paucity of funding, this is probably the best way for governments to proceed. Find good quality private sector partners, talk to them, offer them something on the basket, get them to work together as a PPP or individually, such that some kind of action is injected into the economy. I don't know where else the money is going to come from, because the appetite for foreign investors for Africa right now is not the best. Couple of reasons. One is the state in which we are, I think from outside is far worse than as we see it from inside. Number two, given the state of the euro, I think the returns on the euro is reasonable. And I think that's a risk that they are used to and are capable of handling and have the appetite for. So I think we should then start relying on ourselves and not wait for somebody else to come and help us out.
So creating the environment for people to reduce the risk of investing at home. And that is to say, instead of having what I would call a combative relationship, because there is this tendency, and or kind of combative relationship or kind of between private capital and the state. The private capital sees the state as trying to gouge. There's not a cooperative feeling in that sense. Now, one of our audience members has asked that we have been focusing on the Anglophone African countries. How different is it? Is there a different culture in this regard in the Francophone African countries? Ramesh, I know you have you spend quite a bit of time in Francophone West Africa.
Okay, so in my view, I think Benin is a very good example of what can be done. A lot of us are talking about Rwanda as a model country where a lot of good things have happened. Infrastructure, policy, system, structure have all sort of come to place. And we all know what was in the country in the early 90s. So the kind of progress it's made is remarkable. And you must go to Kigali to see it and believe it. And recently, I did a 600-kilometer drive from Kigali, and I can promise you there was not one pothole. So somebody has got something right, and we have to give credit for that. Okay. Now, Benin, I lived in Benin 28 years back. And for a very long time since, it was a sleepy little country. Cotonou was a quiet little town, a few restaurants, nice beach, and that's about it. What the current government has done is transformed. When I say transformed, I'm not using the word lightly. It's transformed the infrastructure it's an unrecognizable city now. And the government means business. And it is possible to go have conversations of value. The quality of the people that we speak to in the government is also quite different from what I am used to. So I'm very impressed by what transformation has happened in Benin. So we are well invested in Benin as a group, and we are very happy where we are. So we think that those are the kind of models that can sustain and carry on. It calls for that kind of quality of leadership and that kind of vision. Ivory Coast, on the other hand, I don't know how many of you have tracked Ivory Coast in the past, but it's an agricultural wonder. where it was in the early 90s to where it was around 2010 was completely different. The cocoa crop, it's a very agri. It's got, if I remember right, 22% of its GDP is agriculture. But then it's a major producer of large high-value crops like cocoa, coffee, rubber, cotton, and all of this has come up in the last 20 years. So my view is there is a structure. There are rules and regulations that are followed. It's a very sane set of policies that help businesses. And I know significant businesses that are well invested there and are happy investing and working in Ivory Coast. So French Africa is slightly different. The days of the French domination of those economies are in the past. That's no longer the case. At least 10, 15 years back, all that has changed.
So, I mean, what can you say is the learning here for what can we learn from Francophone Africa to Anglophone Africa? Is there something here that, apart from, kind of wishing that everything was different, right? What's a practical advice here or opinion? What can be learned?
Okay, three things. One is that I think French Africa decided quite early, let's say 20 years back, that conversations with private sector is important to understand what is it that makes them tick. I think that understanding exists. Number two is that implementation, that is the critical difference. Implementation of the policies that were put in place for investors to come and invest and succeed has been put in place and it works. Okay, which means there is documentation, which means there is tedious bureaucracy, but in the end, we all stand to benefit. And if you get past that and put a system in your own workspace to overcome that, I think the success is interesting. Number three, they have built scale. So Benin, such a small country, is Africa's largest cotton crop. Ivory Coast, we all know, cocoa and coffee and everything else. They have built scale. But it's a concerted government effort to build that scale. It didn't happen automatically. There was a parastatal setup that made it happen. Ghana's Cocoa, English Africa, is successful because Ghana's Cocoa Board is a very committed, well-run organization for many, 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 many years. So there is a method in that madness that works.
So it's not a secret formula, I think,
No.
because I remember, I'm old enough, when I grew up in Nigeria, I remember the cotton board and the groundnut board. I'm of an age when I tell students that I saw the groundnut pyramids. It was in my lifetime. People say no, it's only pictures. It's not real. When Nigeria was the world's largest cotton exporter and the largest groundnut exporter, and there were facilities provided. There were buying agents who went across the country, buying up these things and transporting them, arranging, some of the great fortunes in, Dantata fortune comes from groundnut. They were the largest buyers of groundnut in northern Nigeria, which is, now the Dangote fortune also. This is where it came from, was agriculture. So we know how to do so. It's not that this is a secret magic formula that we're kept to ourselves. And I suppose maybe then we are seeing kind of people coming back to first principles and understanding how to make these things work. And I think that there is certainly some space. I think that moving away from one of the issues for me always is the commodity side of the commodity dependence, and that's always going to be a challenge, I think, in Africa, because you're dependent. Governments are dependent on prices of commodities which are quite volatile. Now we are hearing that there's a copper shortage coming up, so maybe Zambia and some other countries will benefit. But by and large, I mean, most of the academic research on commodity prices indicates that on average, if you take a long period, there's no real money to be made here. There are boom and bust, but on average, it's quite a low amount of money. So I think perhaps, and this is where Nosa, I mean, the move away from over-dependence on one commodity, the diversification of the economy might be something. What do you think, Nosa?
Absolutely. I mean, that's very clear, isn't it? The structure of African economies, if you look at the economic history of Africa, the structure of African economies has not changed much. Right from independence, most African countries have still been, and still remain exporters of natural resources. And over the years, there's been this incapacity to develop and engage in trade in finished products. And so, of course, that is a barrier to economic growth. I mean, it's affected economies negatively. And again, Nigeria is a very good example. Nigeria has been producing oil for like 60 years, over 60 years, but has not been able to build good refineries, has not been able to develop an industry, a veritable industry around oil and gas sector. So yes, absolutely, the incapacity and inability of African economies to diversify over the years has been very terrible for not just the economies, but also for the people. And well, so what is happening now? And so I see a ray of hope. When I look at certain countries, I mean, Nigeria, Kenya, and we see areas of, so over the last 10 years, we've seen the oil sector contributing less and less to GDP. And we see other areas, especially services, and tech, and manufacturing contributing more and more to GDP. So there is a recognition in government cycles that for African economies to do well, they must diversify. But I also like to speak, Professor Narula, to the issue you brought up, which I think is very important: the constant contest between state and capital. And it is clear that is a barrier to economic growth. Why is that a barrier? And we can see that, again, I use Nigeria as an example, and it happens in many African countries. There is a cadre of politicians who see capital as a threat, private capital as a threat. And this was a statement that was well made and well explained by the former Nigerian Minister of Finance, who is now the president of WTO. Now, the state itself tends to work as a threat to private capital. We see this in the unprecedented taxation of investments in the country, of companies in Nigeria. Multiple taxations, both starting from the federal level to local levels. Of course, these tends to be, what this does is to disincentivize companies or people from investing in the economy. Then we also look at the incapacity or inability, or just, the incapacity of the state government to stand by contractual agreements. Yeah. And we saw this recently in a state called Kogi State in Nigeria that threatened and in fact took moves to take over a cement company owned by Dangote. After contracts have been signed years ago, investments have been made. So the message that is sent to investors, both local and foreign, by the strong arm of government, when government intervenes brutally the way it does, whether through taxation or through brute force, is that private capital is not welcome.
I think this is actually a very critical. It's not just about Africa. I should say. There's there are a number of studies that show that that investment is not so much affected by stringent regulation, but the fact that regulation changes irregularly and in unpredictable ways. So people don't mind get used to the regulation. They learn to work with or around the regulations or the taxation or whatever, as long as it's constant. And not this is why China continues to be popular, because that Chinese Communist Party is in charge and it will remain in charge, and whatever deal you've signed, it's valid. Whereas in India, for instance, the government suddenly says, "Oh, Vodafone, you owe us taxes for 20 years ago." And we changed our mind about the regulation. So this becomes so stability of regulation and stability of institutions is one of those things that is what you're pointing out. And I think that's something to be said also for the Rwanda story that Ramesh, you point out, is that we have seen a consistent regulatory framework, and one where contractual agreements are honored without having to do side payments. I know somebody asked earlier, and I apologize for my delay in coming to some of these questions, but there's a Q&A bringing up the issue of corruption. And I understand this is, of course, is a big issue. But I have to say that corruption is a problem everywhere, and I'm not entirely certain that all the problems can be put at the doorstep of corruption. Ramesh, you have done business in 3 or 4 continents. What's your view on this?
Okay, my view is that there are parts of Asia that compete very favorably with Africa as far as corruption is concerned. And I think one has to get used to the fact that developing world will come with that, inbuilt baggage. We have to learn to manage it, or choose to forego the attractive returns that are here if you manage your business well. I don't think there's a third way around this. So the option is to say, no, I'm not interested in doing all of this. Let me go back to, let's say, Geneva, for example, and live with a significantly smaller margin with a smaller risk. So be it. That's up to you. I believe most developing countries, from my experience of Asia and Africa, are similar. Yeah. Okay, so I can't pick and choose to say that Africa is any worse. I think a lot of businesses use corruption as a garb to suggest that they fail because of that reason. I think there are ways in which you manage your circumstances and succeed despite that. The opportunity is fantastic. I think the capacity to convert that opportunity into reality is a huge strategic challenge and requires all kinds of qualities. If you can bring that to fore, there is enough returns for any investors, my view.
So I think seeing that the idea of investment, one of the short-sightedness of policymakers often is that you're not going to, in order for you to get a share of the rent, you need to wait for it to mature. It's like trying to harvest the fruits of the tree before the tree has grown, and this impatience, then overcharging it. It's like taking like plucking all of the fruit on the second day that you see the flowers, which is not really a very productive solution in the long run. You've got nothing to see. So I think there is a certain amount of greed also, which is, I'm not entirely certain that this is on the side of politicians. And this idea of having a private-public partnership requires, of course, the state to back off and see that the growth of the company is the growth of the country, and they're not stealing from us. They're sharing it. Now, of course,
so Raj, sorry to interrupt, Raj. If you don't secure a PPP, there's one more solution. Yeah. You could get financing from people like Afrexim Bank, the IFC, and people like that, which sort of ring fences you from unnecessary troubles. Okay, the success of those lenders, stroke investors, then gets tied to your success. And I think that's a good format to engage in African investments because it gives you some kind of protection.
Yeah.
Now, I think so. Sorry, Professor Narula. Corruption versus good macroeconomic policies. For me, that is the contest in Africa. I think corruption is terrible, very terrible, and it's affected economies in a very bad way. But I do not think, and I do not believe that has been the major reason why fundamental progress has not been made in driving economic growth and even development. Again, if you look at the economic history of countries, as recent as the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, countries that have made remarkable progress, especially in Asia, the Asian tigers. We saw presidents of the generals who ruled South Korea in the 60s and 70s and turned South Korea into a first world country, being jailed in the 90s and 2000s for stealing billions of dollars. So if we look at the economic history of the United States, I mean, it was in the 19th century, there was corruption there. So corruption is not the major reason why we've not made progress. Rather, it has been the poor macroeconomic policies that we've deployed. And this attempt to suborn every institution and everything about the state, the private capital and every institution to the control of a regime. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. I think one of the, there's a question here, which I think I will just quickly answer from Rajib Sanyal. How are high oil prices benefiting oil producers such as Nigeria and Angola? Now, I can't speak for Angola, and I will leave this to one of our panelists to mention, but I know that in the case of Nigeria, the high oil prices are good, but then because they don't refine any petroleum in Nigeria, you have to then export it only to re-import the finished product, and then that finished product is subsidized by the state. So
of about $10 billion.
Yes, it's 10, which is roughly speaking the deficit, and the annual this year's deficit. That's how big a problem. So it's not really. It should have been a boom, but it's not a boom. It's actually it's a double-edged sword in that way. And I don't know about Angola, what the story is with Angola. Angola is, in my view, probably the most corrupt country on the planet. But maybe no, Ramesh, you've been there, I'm sure.
Yeah. So Raj, I've run a business there for like 4 years. But I was fortunate to be running it in the transition period from the Dos Santos regime to the new one. And I must say that when I went there during the earlier regime, I thought this was the worst African country I have been to, and I've been to 31 of them. So when I say worst, please understand that I meant in terms of infrastructure, in terms of services, in terms of how they looked after foreigners and how they reacted to the whole package was terrible. But what has changed? One is that I think harnessing of the natural resources and the funds that come from that is in a far better shape and far better hands now. The banks are significantly better funded. I think policy structures are in far better shape than they were earlier, which means you as an investor can actually go and negotiate, discuss, get a favorable policy to actually, put your money down. And that is showing results over the last 4 to 5 years. So it is no longer the mess it was. It has significant potential, great quality of land, and very vast coastline. My view is that they're bigger challenges in terms of health and education and stuff like that. So they need to crack those problems first. But it's in a far better shape now, Raj, than you probably remember from or that you heard of.
Mm-hmm. So I think that we're really. This issue, I think what we're moving towards is that, we're going to see a slowdown for sure. But it's by no means going to last longer than it might in the developed countries. Is this a fair summary of what we have said thus far? There will be a slowdown. It is going to affect things. Things are going to get worse, but it isn't hopeless. We are going to see the winds of positive change will come, but it shouldn't. See, of course, one of the concerns is that we should not be passively waiting for this to happen. That is to say, we're waiting for commodity prices to go up and everything will be fine. I mean, that lesson is what we can learn from Nigeria. The commodity prices have gone up, but nothing is fine. Because we are too dependent upon one commodity for everything, and that's also badly managed. So I think that's really moving forward is a challenge. There is, this. I want to come back to the conversation about investment, and we have a question here asking about the role of China plays in investing in African countries, especially in infrastructure development. I mean, let me say in the up front that I'm a skeptic about this as a magic solution to anything at all. The Chinese are investors just like everybody else. They're looking for a return, and they're looking for the same kind of return or in same size of return as everybody else. They're not doing it. Nothing is happening because they are feeling benevolent. There is a clear business case for these investments. So there's no such thing as free infrastructure, despite what governments sometimes feel that, oh, they don't have to pay for 50 years. Never, generally the general rule of thumb is everybody wants their money back. Doesn't matter what passport you're carrying, and they would want more than their money back if possible. It is important to remember that the Chinese investors are not just limited to developing countries; they are everywhere. So if they're not getting their ROI on Africa, they're getting ROI on the same the one that they want in Latin America or in Asia or anywhere else. So much so that not becoming important. Despite the whole bridge and road, whatever Belt and Road thing.
So Raj, I think there is a difference. The difference is I've seen China operating at its peak of its investments in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa, Tanzania, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, countries like that. And the big difference between them and the Western investors were, one, they injected really low quality companies to come and work in Africa. Okay, which meant they were complete and total and outright exploiters of labor, of resources, and didn't care a damn about what they left behind them. That was number one. Number two, they brought really low quality plant and machinery to work in whichever sector they undertook, whether it was mining, whether it's building roads, building buildings, building hotels, building whatever. And in the bargain, I think they left no trained African labor behind them. Okay. And number three, they were extremely unscrupulous in their negotiations with the leaders. I think they really took advantage of the fact that Africa was on a back foot, especially after the GFC. So my view is that in my view, they're definitely not quality long-term partners because they have no long-term in mind.
Yeah, I don't think, no, sir.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Ramesh. And we can see these, the Chinese have been very disciplined in their investment, yet very, very unaltruistic. They know what they want and they come in and get it. And we learned in school that with FDIs come capital, comes skills and the rest. But that's not happened in the case of China. What has simply happened is, look, in the mining sector in Nigeria, they've come in and basically are involved in mining large scale in certain parts of the country and degrading the land. And no training, no skills being acquired by those who work with them. So no, while they've been very disciplined, they've been very, very, very bad I would say they've been very, very bad. And based on the investigations I've done, especially in the mining sector, they've been very bad for the mining sector in Nigeria.
There's a comment in the chat box, no, so I don't know if you've seen it, by Alan, which so in fact, he's specifically asking you, he said, are there colonial concerns with regard to private investment, i.e. the sort of old story of Western MNCs of neo-colonialism with Chinese multinationals taking over local resources? How is that argument used to deter foreign investment to preserve the elite and local domestic actors? I think there are 2 or 3 questions in here. Let's start with the first one. And I think we sort of have answered the first one, that is to say, are there concerns that do Chinese investors behave better than Western MNCs? And I think the answer there is clearly no. In fact, it's probably worse. But there is this somewhat left-wing view of foreign capital as an exploiter of neo-colonial force that just takes everything and goes away. And I think one of the changes in political economy is been that this rehabilitation of the multinational. So until the 80s, I would say the view was predominantly in developing countries of neo-colonial thing that that multinationals were like the East India Company or the Royal Niger Company, and so on. And now the view was that if you structure it correctly, they will leave something behind. And this is where we come to capital and technology and training thing. and that one of the new view of multinational, which has not sadly caught on as much as it should, that if you are able to, if you negotiate this properly, they will come and train people. They will come and offer skills. They will. It's not just. Of course, the big thing for Africa and for most developing countries is employment, creating employment, and of course, upgrading manpower. These are the two. People focus on the amount of dollars of investment. I ask, what is the employment effects? It's more important that you've employed 500 people, you've trained 100 people, you've added to the economy. It's almost as important as how much FDI that came in. And I think this is something, attitude that hasn't gone away completely. The idea that multinationals are here to exploit, and of course there's a good reason for that. From slavery onwards, we have this Africa's contact with the original proto multinationals has been to take, and not give in anything back. So there is that view that persists. I'm not sure how much. Maybe I'm getting, not maybe, I know I'm getting old. So Nosa, you're younger, faster, more aware model. What do you think?
Well, there is, so this again, it goes back to the issue. For me, it goes back to the issue of the state and capital, and African politicians tend to bellow out this rhetoric about the West and the West that takes and does not give back, and so citizens look at the West and see multinational companies and relate that and say, oh, this is the West. I mean, the West, the sea, are the multinational companies. But the truth of the matter is that multinational companies are there to do business. And to do business means they have to make profits. But at the same time, they've been a force for good. And we can see, people forget that up until 1978, China was a basket case. And until Deng Xiaoping decided to come up with his economic reform programs. And of course, the economic reforms envision and did bring in large-scale foreign investments into China. And so it's a little bit difficult. The reality is that African economies do not have the capacity to mobilize the capital they need to drive growth, to drive development. And so they need capital from outside. And multinational companies, as well as multinational institutions, are able to provide that capital, whether in terms of liquid capital, in terms of machineries, in terms of skills, and at the same time provide employment, which is very critical, which is what you said, Professor Narula, because unemployment is a massive issue in the continent. A large segment of the population are unemployed. And of course, with unemployment comes lack of skills, lack of training, and then generationally, it means that you have a generation of unskilled people who are unable to gain new knowledge and new skills. So multinational companies provide, fit into this gap and provide this kind of knowledge, skills, capital, capabilities. And we look, again, let's use the Asian tigers as an example. The progress made in Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Asia, and the rest. Yeah, Asia would not be made without multinational companies.
Yeah.
So there should be no fear of multinational.
Well, I mean, the point, I think, I always think that it's like giving somebody the keys of your house and saying, have a good time. Now, if you're not there to keep an eye on your guest is going to take your silverware. It's your own fault for letting him in your house and not keeping, I guess I welcome, but you have to create some boundary conditions for them. And I think this idea that, we should treat investment as they only do good. No, I mean, frankly, I know I don't go and count my spoons after my guests leave, but, it's not beyond some of them to help themselves to stuff before they go. And it's about learning how to create those. And I think so the framework, I'm being colloquial, but it is about creating the right framework. And the Asian economies did establish contractual obligations. They did have oversight of investment. They did have performance targets, and they enforced these performance targets. And this is something that, I mean, I know for a fact that Nigeria had the same performance targets in the 70s. I read the import substitution laws of Nigeria carefully. They are very detailed. They are the same quality as those in Taiwan. I really was quite impressed with them. But they were not implemented in any way.
But never implemented. Exactly.
Yeah.
Raj, there is one thing to note though. While the Asian tigers allowed multinationals to come in and under strict contractual frameworks, allowed them to survive and add value to the country, the quality, size, and scale of the local entrepreneurs who have thrived in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam even, are immense. And I think the value they added to the local wealth creation for locals was amazing. And there was no real restriction to multinationals to compete with them freely. So the number of names I can give you from these 4 or 5 countries that, and India, of course, is a different case altogether. But the Asian tigers, the way Nosa described them, have created so many wealthy locals in that period, which has been, I think, immensely valuable for the country. And huge legacy and huge role models for local population to succeed.
So I think one of the what is of course this is music to my ears since I work on FDI and development as it's been one of my themes of my research for the last 30 years. But I think that I think that there is scope which we are not really, because these are long-term projects, and understanding the one of the things that you can go across West Africa and Senegal, and so you can see these these abandoned factories, Nigeria as well. You have all these abandoned factories, textile mills. When the cotton was being grown, and there were people who were making yarn, and the yarn was being processed and so forth. And this, of course, all vanished. It's not that labor is cheaper. Is cheaper from in Bangladesh or in Myanmar. When you think about, when you come down to it, the cost can be the same. It's very competitive nowadays, especially. Now, so I think certainly there is some opportunity for things to happen. The question is whether governments will take the trouble. Now, to what extent, and I put this as, because we've had 2 webinars on the African continental free trade area. Do you think this will have any effect on growth in the longer run? Do you think there's some scope here for intra-African investments?
So, from my experience, I can't think of African businesses having expanded beyond largely the country or at best the region. And bulk of the regional successes are in East Africa and not in West Africa, right? Forget the banks for a minute. Let's talk of businesses, any sector, any industry. So one part is, I think there is a significant advantage of remaining in your domain of comfort and domain of influence. And that provides them protection and provides them an opportunity that they don't get anywhere else. I also believe in most of our African countries, each country has 4 or 5 businesses that dominate bulk of the industries. And they'd rather leave it like that than get somebody else to come in. My view, therefore, is that even the regional blocks don't work as efficiently as they should. So we'll come to AFCFTA at a later stage. When the regional blocks start functioning efficiently first, that might be a harbinger of what might work on a Pan-African basis. I really think Pan-Africa is far, 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 far too big for it to function as one unit in the near future. Nosa, what do you think?
Well, yes, I agree to a large extent. Again, you look at the main economies in each of the regions. Nigeria, for example, Nigeria does a lot of the products used in neighboring countries in Benin, Chad, Niger, Cameroon do come from Nigeria, but then they're not significant enough. That's the truth. They're just not significant enough, and the reason is very simple. not much of significance is produced in Nigeria for export to these countries. They still get the bulk of their exports from the West, from France, from Europe. So one of the things I always say is that I will expect that countries within the region engage with themselves more. First of all, Nigeria, Ghana, Benin, Niger, Chad, and the rest do more trade between themselves first. And South Africa and SADC countries do more trade between themselves. Kenya and the other East African countries do more trade between themselves first. And that way, perhaps ACTFA can work.
So do you realize that bulk of the trade, bulk of the regional trade is very port dependent. So SADC trade happens largely because Durban is a feeding port or Maputo is a feeding port.
Absolutely.
The Tema feeds, and sometimes Lomé feeds into Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso. So it's not really products of Ghana that is going there. It is products that transit through Ghana, where Ghana provides services like trucking and everything else that feeds into those markets. So I'm not sure we are yet at a stage where we can produce and sell into the rest of the African countries. And I can tell you that produce that we are producing here that we want to take to South Africa and to Kenya, for example, we are in that discussion right now. It is just frightfully too expensive. We just can't get sea freight that makes sense to be able to supply there. They'd rather buy it from somewhere else.
So yeah, so the infrastructural bottlenecks and transportation bottlenecks still remain, and I think that that intra-African trade is probably going to. I mean, you know, I know whenever my friends who are focused on the African Continental Free Trade Area, and I bring up ECOWAS, and they always roll their eyes. You know, ECOWAS has been, you know, constrained by Nigeria, of course, largely by it's not. There's been no attempt to make ECOWAS into a functioning story, but we do see the East African area having this. We have the SADC thing going on, and I suppose there is some potential for this. I mean, the ECOWAS could have taken off that highway they built along the, you know, which goes through Ghana and Nigeria. You would see that. But I always tell people about the, you know, difficulty going from, I remember having to go from Senegal to Nigeria, and there's 2 flights a week, unless you fly through Casablanca or Paris or, and it's neither is it a Senegalese airline nor is it a Nigerian airline. It's Kenya Airways that's flying across West Africa. So there is a bottleneck certainly in terms of these things, but there is a potential, I believe, for this. And unfortunately, I think it requires more than just passing the legislation. It's the implementation of the legislation one of the I'm deliberately going to steer this conversation to the issue of informality. Because 80% of the working age population of Nigeria is in the informal sector. That is to say, precarious employment, casual employment, small traders, you know, casual laborers, casual farmers. You know, really kind of just survival on the survival basis, and that number I think is around 70% across most of sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot of trade that goes on that we don't count. I mean, it has been going on for centuries. I'm old enough to remember seeing the camel caravans coming across the Sahara in Nigeria. I would see. I mean, I remember trying to count. I was a kid, and you would count. I think I got to 100, and I got bored. A number of camels that were coming in one straight line across from Niger, and this was so there was a lot of trade going on, you know, and it's this that now only recently disappeared. The same thing we're going to have with next. By the way, the December webinar is going to be on the informal economy in Africa, and one of our speakers has been studying the informal trade between Kenya, Uganda, even though there's a formal agreement. But the informal trade actually continues. People are just used to conducting that trade. So, and informality is a very strange thing, because on the one hand, you're staying out of the tax, the people don't want to be involved with the state. They're afraid of the state. They have rational reasons to avoid the state. So they don't want to register their company. They don't want to, but then they don't have any skills, and they need support from government infrastructure to get skills, to acquire, get capital, to borrow money from a bank, from a small whatever, some kind of credit union or something like that. So there's a kind of a stalemate, because there are literally 80% of the population not interested in engaging with the state, or doing everything they can, and in the process they're also being marginalized. And that leads to Aloysius's point, which he brings up about the youth of Africa. The youth of Africa, Aloysius, have no skills, or very non-tradable skills. This is, I'm not making an exaggeration, that you need to get people the skills who of the right quality before they become an asset which will be an attraction for whether a domestic investor or foreign investors. Unfortunately, this is a kind of, but no, sir, maybe you have a more positive view of this.
Close to 60% of the economy is hidden. It's black.
Yeah.
And a large part of this informal economy is also what is that part that does business with neighboring countries. Well, the truth of when it's talking about the youth of Africa, again, look at Nigeria. Sorry, can anyone hear me?
Yes,
I can hear you.
Seems frozen. Oh, great. So, just like you said, Professor Narula, there is a skill deficit in the continent. I can speak to Nigeria. When people look at youths, they tend to look at the youths in the urban centers, those doing tech, those engaged in tech, those engaged in the telecom sector. But the reality is that if you go to large parts of the country outside the urban cities, there is a skills deficit, knowledge deficit among youth in the country. And I've spoken to speaking to a number of managers who say they have to retrain constantly. They have to train, provide skills to youths to come work for them, to engage in our work with them. So over the years, there's been a neglect by governments within the continent. Again, I'll speak about Nigeria. There's been a veritable neglect of in terms of providing quality education to people to citizens. And you can see this in the quality of higher education in the continent. In Nigeria, practically all the state-owned universities are not up to par. And so they do not provide the necessary skills, competencies, and knowledge and skills that is needed to try to work and thrive in a modern competitive economy.
Yeah, no, I you're completely on your understand where you're coming from. There's a gentleman here who is asking here, if you can see the chat, he feels that they are in. So my experience working in some African countries, one is surprised that you will find more skilled workers in parts of Nigeria, than in most parts of Africa. I think the point is really the same, essay, that you can find good people everywhere, but do you find them in the quantity that will be an attraction to an investor to establish themselves? I can anecdotally, I can give you many examples. The problem, of course, is that we have, at least I can say this for Nigeria, the data is terrible. You want to find out how many people educated or skill levels, etc. But even without that, there is my experience of talking to investors is that finding consistently good quality people is challenging. And Ramesh is employs a lot of, I don't know how many people you employed in Olam, but it was tens of thousands of people. And so, I mean, you can comment on this better than I can.
So, in my tenure with Olam, what I discovered was that the 20 plus farms that we managed, even for farming, which is, employs 60-70% of Africa's population, they had to be trainers who came in from other parts of the world. South Africa, Zimbabwe are all great farmers, so they were also good role models. But that is one part of the challenge. So when you farm in Tanzania, you farm in other parts of Africa, you needed to take people out there to show how good quality farming is done. So that was one part. In the company that I work now, we have significant assets to manufacture, so convert food into produce. Now, even over here, technicians, operators, you have to import the talent, train people. It takes 2-3 years, and then the foreigners can go back. So without doubt, good quality people are available, but they're not skilled or trained. Not necessarily their fault. There's probably not enough exposure, probably not enough opportunities, definitely not enough technical schools. So as my Nigerian director told me recently, the problem with us is that we don't have those technical schools available where the youth can go and learn to become a good quality mason or a good quality tile layer, even those basic skills. I think we have to solve those problems to provide skill and therefore provide employment, and therefore give assurances to investors that those skills will be available as much as they want. All they need to do is invest.
Yeah, I think this is really a problem. The idea of kind of polytechnics or vocational schools, and this is not just true in Nigeria, but it's across continent, is vocational schools. And this is not just true in Africa as well. I mean, I was in India 3 or 4 years ago, and I met this Swiss guy who was who was an electrician in India. So I thought, this is a country with 1 billion people. Surely enough, Indian electricians, and a Swiss electrician charging Swiss prices for his labor. And he says, no, people want good quality. The rich people want good quality wiring. So he has a kind of philanthropic side where he trains electricians to the Swiss standard, and then he acts as a contractor, and you can get the actual Swiss person to do it for you, or you can get Swiss trained Indians to do it for you. And people were willing to pay what must be 20 times the price of a local actor to do this. And I've seen the same thing. I've got a friend who has owned a hotel in Abuja, and if he wants to get carpentry done, he flies in people from Lagos, because he said he can't find, he knows exactly who he needs, but there are not enough people that meet that quality level. Yeah, now, I mean, offering basic skills is a really important thing, but in order to offer the basic skills, you must have the people who have the skills in the first place. And this is often a problem, that you have training. And this is one of the way we can kind of bring the discussion to a close for today, is that Namdi Madichi asks in the question, he says, how can we equalize the North-South equilibrium in international, in education? Let's go with education. And I tend to see this as a kind of also a problem, is that how can we afford to have that quality of education? You bring in experts from abroad, people are going to want to get paid. You can see the brain drain. We can talk about brain drain. I was educated in Nigeria, and I'm certainly not doing very much work in Nigeria. And I know hospitals in the UK full of Nigerian doctors. Everyone is abroad because they would feel more they would like to get recompense for their work. So how do we start? Where do we break the cycle of brain drain? Where do you get people to come back? Where do we get the skills? And where will the government pay well enough for this, for them to come and teach, rather than have a guy teaching technicians to do electrical wiring, as opposed to doing the electrical wiring and making money from it? Because there's no incentive in teaching. There's no reward for teaching, at least not in the developing country. The same thing happens in India. I've seen this. I was recently in India, and you go to universities, and it's very disappointing. There are some top elite universities that are brilliant, and there are a lot of useless universities where you wonder, you feel like shooting somebody. You meet someone, an engineer, who says he doesn't know how to use Windows. It's too complicated for him. And he's an electrical engineer. And he said, this PDF, he couldn't fill the PDF because it was too difficult for him. So you can see the quality, the huge quality variation in many developing countries. But it is paramount, in the long run, skills, building up skills, and that's where schools come in. Again, the state can't afford to run all these schools at the quality, so there's a private industry. The private universities. Henley, Africa is not a state-run institution; it's a private institution. We charge proper money for it, but then we provide the skills. The problem is a trade-off. How much can you do as a private institution without and continue to generate rent? I think that's the real question. So closing remarks. Let's start with Ramesh.
Great. Thank you for an engaging session. My view is that things are not as bleak as I think they are made out to be sitting outside. I think we are in far better shape than most people think we are in. I do believe that a little bit of governmental alertness right now will help. And like I said during the conversation, we should get our investors to reinvest a bit more in the country to engage and kickstart the economy all over again. People are waiting for employment. I think business can expand their business because eventually we will come good. And all investors must view this as a longer term commitment because nobody's looking for returns in 1 year, 2 years. And definitely, I think by end of 23, beginning of 24, things will turn around. So my view is that it's a slowdown, not a recession. And I think there's a lot more gas in the tank than you think there is.
Let me just say that the informality webinar will be, as it always is, the first Thursday of every month. 1st of December is a Thursday, and that's when we'll be having the informality conversation. And we have a couple of very interesting discussants who have a particular interest in East Africa. So we'll have a conversation more about this, as opposed to a Nigeria bias, we'll have an East African bias next week. And I think that let me just say that that Nosa will be back for sure at another webinar later on, and I'd like to thank him. Hopefully, I will find a way to thank him another time to thank him on behalf of the audience. Thank you. You've all been a great audience. I very much appreciate the questions. I hope to see you on December 1 for the next session. We will be having, as I said, this is a monthly conversation. Feel free to write to us, send things in. And sorry, Ramesh.
Sorry, Raj. Sorry to interrupt you. I just am unhappy about the fact that when it comes to recession, you come to Nigeria, and when you want to discuss informality, you go to East Africa. That's a bit unfair.
It has been noted, and we will do what we can to address the situation.
Sorry, please carry on.
That's right. So everybody, thank you very much. Thank you to Ramesh. Thank you to Nosa. And thank you to the audience. See you on December 1. And in the meantime, yes, have a good month.
Dunning Africa Centre. It's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation.